Hello, and welcome to a session at CyFy 2021 on the new great game, Tech Cooperation in an Era of Gated Globalization. Over the next 45 minutes, we'll have a rich discussion with an excellent panel of experts on the intersections of geopolitics, globalization, and technology. I'll briefly introduce them before turning to them for some questions, and hopefully we will have a lively discussion. I have with us James A. Lewis, Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Abdul-Hakeem Ajijola, Chairman of Consultancy Support Services Limited, former Senior Special Assistant for Innovation and Technology to the National Security Advisor to the President of Nigeria, Lisa Curtis, Senior Fellow and Director at the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. She was previously Senior Director for South Asia at the National Security Council in the United States. And finally, Dr. C. Rajamohan, Director of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. This is a very broad but very complex and very important set of issues that we'll be discussing, covering a wide range of areas with military and civilian applications and a vast array of emerging technologies that could potentially have a really transformative effect on national economies and the global balance of power. So with that, let me turn to Dr. Rajamohan for the first question. How would you say the world and some of our common assumptions about globalization have changed over the past several years? Economic and technological codependence was believed for many years to incentivize peace and cooperation, particularly amongst the major powers. Is that assumption being tested, and why?
I think it's been tested and found wanting. One, in the domestic politics of major countries like the United States, where the belief that globalization was of, unmitigated blessing, that has been challenged. We can argue with that. I mean, the elite view in Washington, New York, and Silicon Valley still sees as the centrality of globalization. But the politics in the heartland have changed. And I think we've seen first articulated by President Trump and now in a different manner, but the same concerns are being raised by President Biden. So I think both the leaders, are responding to significant changes in the domestic politics on issues of inequality, which the globalization has produced, and the kind of shifting of jobs. I mean, whether you call it outsourcing of labor, insourcing of labor, outsourcing of jobs, which has generated all kinds of concerns. Now, you could argue some of these concerns are not accurate, but the fact is today they're real and they're affecting politics in the United States. So there is no consensus today in Washington that free trade is a good thing, or that there is any support for a fresh round of trade liberalization. That's where we are. And in India, India moved out of that belief in globalization because it found the Chinese the trading with China saw India's own manufacturing being hollowed out. So well before the current crisis, India walked out of the RCEP because of the fears of the Chinese domination of the Asian economic order. And in China too, I mean, it's not just US and India, but it's also China. I mean, China, which has taken full advantage of last 2 decades of globalization, now has adopted a strategy of dual circulation, which is, while benefiting from external circulation, it wants to strengthen domestic circulation and strengthen itself by denying access, for example, to the US technology companies, by strengthening its own, corporations and capabilities, and tilt the game even further in its favors. So I think we are stuck in some situation where domestic politics in major countries, as well as China's weaponization of trade, its attempt to use its levers or the international trade system to unilateral advantage, I think have pushed us beyond a particular a Rubicon, if you will. So unless there is a fresh compact between all the major trading nations, that globalization needs to be reordered, fresh rules need to be devised. The current crisis, I suspect, will continue.
If I may just follow up quickly, you mentioned the US and China and India. What about Europe and Southeast Asia and other sort of major clusters of economic activity in the world?
So we've seen it in Britain to some extent, where the globalization was an issue and how Britain, in the name of sovereignty, walked out of the European Union. But I think In Japan, for example, I mean, which has been a great champion of RCEP, of globalization, the new prime minister, let's see how long he's there, but he said that it's not just about reform and further liberalization of the Japanese economy, but welfare, much like Biden and Trump, that you need to do more about domestic consumption, domestic job securities. So I think there is an interesting shift in the Japanese debate. I'm not an expert on Europe, but you can see even in Europe, I mean, to some extent, it's varied from country to country. But this idea that it's simply open up, let there be trade. I mean, maybe Germany has one kind of view because Germany is a great exporter. I don't know if that is shared by other countries in the region. So my sense is if you take out two big players like US, in fact, even one player like the United States, if it questions the assumptions on which WTO was founded, China's entry into the WTO was accepted, then you had one player is good enough with such strength to demand a fresh look at the rules and need to work rules that will benefit everyone rather than the current situation where it certainly seemed to have worked in Chinese favor in the near term.
Turning it over to the implications for technology, Dr. Lewis, in what areas and how are recent trends in globalization affecting trends in technological development and cooperation? What do you see as some of the key developments in technology policy in recent years?
Well, I'm reluctant to even use the term globalization anymore because underlying it is a fear in many countries of a reliance on a global supply chain. And that's partially a result of COVID, partially a result of the bifurcation. So that's the political direction we will be moving away from a dependence on globalization. Bifurcation between the US and China is clearly important. The issue there is how do we take China out of supply chains? It's not just the US. The US, of course, has a military conflict with China or a potential military conflict. But other countries are concerned about China's, as Raja said, China's predatory trade behavior. And so you see a general move away from China as a reliable partner. And I think that's probably the biggest effect. Reliable partner, particularly given its penchant for borrowing other people's research and intellectual property. We've seen a diffusion, despite my opening remarks about don't say globalization anymore. We've seen a diffusion of technological capabilities, but it's not global, right? And so if you use artificial intelligence as an example, you have powerful research centers in Canada, in Israel, in the UK, in the United States. You have these capabilities probably in Russia as well and in China. But you have a handful of countries now that dominate the development of technology, and that's unlikely to change in the near term. Finally, on that note, one of the drawbacks, at least in the US, is I'd say a fear of technology. Our old view of progress has been shattered, right? And so if you look at the use of the word progress, it's declined. In the 19th century, science would produce progress. And now you have fear. So the White House came out with a call for an AI Bill of Rights. Nowhere in that does it use words like opportunity or economy, right? Astounding. So we have to think about how this fear of technology will shape development. Science is no longer seen as an unalloyed blessing. We can argue about whether that's the case or not. Certainly the Europeans have tended to focus more on the risks. And so you hear that a lot. Let's talk about the risks of technology. People want to talk about risks more than they did and perhaps less about opportunity. So if you were overstating the case, you'd say the Luddites are winning. And I think that global social change, at least in developed countries, is shaping how we develop technologies.
Thank you. To Lisa Curtis, how is technology policy permeating, with that backdrop, how is technology policy, in your view, permeating national security structures and thinking in the US government? Speaking as somebody who was recently in the US government, did you anticipate this becoming a major area of competition when you joined in 2017? And how did issues related to technology competition feature during your tenure in government?
Well, I have to admit, I did not foresee back in 2017 the extent to which technology would permeate our national security apparatus and our dealings with other countries. But certainly, a couple of years into the Trump administration, you have the 5G issue. And this is really when I believe that the competition with China over technology development and deployment really came into sharp focus, when there was a recognition of the potential dangers posed by Chinese companies dominating the 5G industry. I think it took a while for other countries to see some of these potential dangers, including the UK. But now we see a much greater understanding, even in India, where China was kept out of the 5G trials, or was being kept out of the 5G trials. So I think the Trump administration does deserve credit for spotlighting the issues surrounding 5G in particular. But I have to say, the outbreak of the coronavirus, China's lack of transparency in talking about the origins of the virus, China's aggressive behavior in the spring and summer of 2020, including the border crisis with India, all of these things, I think, have combined to make countries much more skeptical of Chinese domination of technological development, and kind of heighten people's awareness to these dangers. And there's certainly been a general realization, particularly among democratic nations, about the need for resilient technology supply chains and reducing our dependence on China. And I also want to talk a little bit about what's happened domestically, because I think domestically there has been a recognition of this, and we see this in the kinds of legislation that are currently on Capitol Hill. The passing by the Senate of the Innovation and Competition Act this past summer, which authorizes over $100 billion over a 5-year period to bolster U.S. tech research and industry so that we can compete with China more effectively. This was a milestone. Now, of course, we need to see this pass, and particularly the part of the legislation that deals with allocating $52 billion to support the Chips for America Act, which is federal investment in the Commerce Department for domestic semiconductor research, design, manufacture. This is very important, and I think the world is watching to see if the U.S. can sort of get its domestic act together and actually invest in these industries that we need to be competing with China for. There's a lot to say about international cooperation and what we're doing on that front, which I think we're going to get to a little bit later. But I think it is important to see that domestic buy-in, that recognition that competition with China on the technology front is certainly a core national security concern in the United States moving forward.
Mr. Ajijola, for much of the rest of the world, including Africa and your home country of Nigeria, these new realities that the other panelists have spoken about, the growing skepticism of globalization, the fear of technology, the primacy of national security considerations, these appear to complicate development efforts for much of the developing world. What are some of the challenges and opportunities that you see from your vantage point?
Thank you. First of all, I think within us in Africa, and especially at this ultra-high strategic leadership level, we have insufficient or lack of appreciation or awareness on some of these matters, especially as they relate to cybersecurity. I also think across Africa, we have a lack of a consistent approach when it comes to things like cyber norms and the like. And certainly, many leaders across Africa, or many people in positions of leadership, have a perception, or seem to have a perception, that cybersecurity is really not an Africa problem. Now, having said that, I think there are a couple of issues that also come to the fore, taking up from where my colleagues have spoken. First of all, Joseph Nye of Harvard University has mentioned the phrase, the weaponization of interdependence. And this clearly was seen during the Trump era with the kind of pressure that the Trump administration put on Huawei and also on TikTok in terms of, in the case of TikTok, if you don't sell some shares to the Americans, we won't let you into our market. But having said that, even India, because of its own geopolitical challenges with China, I recollect had banned 118 Chinese apps. And the challenge for Africa is that we have to be conscious of not getting, to be the small fodder or the grass that gets trampled upon when the US and China fight, or Europe and Russia fight, or India and China fight, because to some extent, we depend on these nations for our technology value chain. Another challenge we have is also the fragmentation or the potential for fragmentation of the internet. We've seen Russia experiment a couple of times in disconnecting itself from the internet as a country. And we also see that Iran has been experimenting with creating its own version of the internet. Another challenge we see from Africa is the commoditization of broadband. We see this with Starlink, Elon Musk. We see this with Jeff Bezos, and also I think a UK-India partnership, OneWeb in the UK. And while there are a lot of opportunities from this commoditization, basically you are looking at a situation where local providers cannot compete with those kind of large multi-satellite constellations. And I mean, from my own checks, what Starlink is offering for 1 meg of connectivity for about, I think, $11 or $12 a year would cost probably $22,000 from an African satellite. So clearly, our investments in those kind of communication technologies probably are gone. Also, we see a situation of the emergence of the crypto and the digital currencies. And there are three I would bring to the fore. And the reason I bring them to the fore is because they impact monetary policy and money supply in Africa, and basically undermine, by implication, the sovereignty and the power of that's African regulators. Number one is Bitcoin. So Bitcoin has no center, has no owner, ostensibly. So how do you regulate it? Facebook Diem, which we expect to come out either later this year or sometime next year, basically that currency, first and foremost, Facebook reports to its shareholders. Next, it reports to US regulators. In fact, very specifically, California regulators. So again, the challenge of African control, sovereignty, regulatory input. And finally, you have the prospect of the digital yuan. And this is particularly interesting because, again, the digital yuan reports or answers to the Chinese regulator, not the African regulator. That's number one. And the digital yuan does have some advantages in Africa, which, again, are disadvantages to us. First of all, 50% of all the handsets in Africa are made in China. Number two, 70%, that is 70% of all the network infrastructure is Chinese made. And also you have to understand that African nations are debtors, and we owe a lot of money to China. And of course, he who pays the piper tends to call the tune. And lastly, in October 2020, for example, Huawei launched the Mate 40 in South Africa. And the Mate 40 has an inbuilt hardware chip wallet to make these kind of crypto wallets easy to get into, convenient, while at the same time potentially undermining the regulators and the sovereignty of African nations. Thank you.
Thank you. We've discussed in some ways some of the challenges facing all of us collectively, I suppose. But I do want to get a little bit into what some of the path ahead and what some of the potential opportunities or policy options are for collectively. Dr. Rajamohan, some of the key developments you mentioned are being really determined in the United States and in China, the two largest economies. Where does that leave, in your view, the so-called middle powers, and by which I mean India, Japan, etc.? How do they chart a course in this new geopolitical environment?
No, I think if you see, I mean, the middle powers are not helpless. I mean, I think if you see what Europe has done, for example, in shaping the regulation of the digital world, I mean, I think they've been in the leadership. And they've done a lot, which other countries are largely, taking cue from that. And even in the US, which had begun with a completely free, digital universe, to one where the demands for regulation are coming from multiple sources. I mean, in the extraordinary number of bills are being debated in the US on how to regulate the big tech. See, the principal contradiction is this. I mean, I think very few countries have the option of opting out of the China, of the US-led technology companies. I mean, that China has adopted a strategy of creating its own companies, its own ecosystem, its own structure to completely dissociate from the United States. I don't think that model works for the rest of us, which is really, we don't want to break away from the United States. But I think whether it's India, Europe, or a whole lot of countries, want some way of regulating the way the US big tech companies work. So my sense is the interest in adapting a US-led digital universe to a one-to-one that will suit everyone. I think that's a one part of the big agenda that the so-called like-minded countries, which don't want to join the China-led digital world, that's one option. But the large number of small countries, I mean, don't have many choices. So many of them are simply, by sheer power of the Chinese, economic influence, are being sucked in. I mean, once the digital Silk Road gets its full impact on many of the smaller countries, you're going to see a lot of the sucking sound into China by these countries. And there's some in this part of the world, like in ASEAN, where I am. The people are beginning to wake up to a situation where, for example, you have a China cloud, you have an America cloud, right? I mean, that do you, now in the conflict, do you run two cloud systems? You say, look, if the US imposes sanctions on a certain set of actors, based in China. So I think those people are just waking up to those issues, that can you really be nice to both sides, or can you, afford to stay non-aligned in this business? So I think, which is what I think countries like Singapore thought, look, it is really, we can do both. I mean, we want both, we like both. That I think is becoming more difficult given the nature of the contestation. So my sense is that whether it is Facebook, social media, whether it is the nature of digital trade, today I think the like-minded countries, I mean, not just middle or the big, but I think US and its partners will have to take a fresh look at at digital commerce. How do we regulate digital companies? How do we ensure democratic functioning within the power of these companies? Those, I think, we need a debate that brings us together. Otherwise, the fragmentation of this part of the debate will make it even worse in dealing with us, either with China or other authoritarian powers.
Ms. Curtis, could you outline some of the steps that the US government has taken to recently, whether under the previous administration or this one, to improve technology partnerships, including in the Indo-Pacific? What, in your view, should the US be more focused on?
Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about the Quad, because I think that the Quad, the US, India, Japan, Australia, quadrilateral security grouping is really important in this regard. And of course, the Quad was revived during the previous administration, but the Biden administration has really taken it to the next level. The fact that we've had 2 Quad summits in the last, 7 months or so is really quite amazing. And of course, they've actually established working groups to start working through important issues, not only vaccines, climate change, but emerging and critical technologies. And so what you're seeing is the Quad, 4 powerful democracies coming together, pooling their resources, their capabilities, and also bringing to bear their commitment to democratic values to be able to begin to set the standards and principles that will shape the environment in which emerging technologies will be developed and deployed. So I think this is quite remarkable. And if you look at the joint statement that was issued after the most recent summit on September 24th, there's quite a bit of detail on how the countries are going to work together on critical and emerging technologies. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to the fact that it mentions open RAN deployments. This is open radio access network deployments for 5G, which is really an important development. Open RAN technology is a technology alternative to hardware dominant 5G networks. It's essentially wireless infrastructure built on modular architecture with open interfaces or open radio access networks. And in a paper that I recently did with our CNAS expert on technology, Martin Rasser, we noted that the Quad is in a particularly good position to build and promote open RAN deployments as an alternative to what we currently see with the deployment of 5G. And this is important because you'll see more vendors, you'll see vendor diversity, you'll see more secure and more supple supply chain resiliency. So this really is an innovative way to deal with the 5G challenge. But it wouldn't have happened if, number one, the dangers to allowing Chinese companies to dominate 5G infrastructure, if that concern was not raised by governments. And then had they not provided the space for the private sector to be able to innovate and come up with solutions to the problem. So I think this is a good example of finding solutions to these challenges. But of course, the US needs to work in partnership with other countries in trying to do global deployments of these important technologies. And so that's exactly what's happening within the Quad as we speak. But I think Raj is also right. Europe is also extremely important in this game, and very pleased to see the EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific released last month, which has an entire section on digital governance and partnerships. And it talks about enhancing technical policy and research cooperation throughout the Indo-Pacific with a special focus on the ASEAN countries. And the EU has declared it will support the ASEAN Digital Master Plan of 2025 and its support for ASEAN's increasing role in shaping common data protection standards. So I think the EU approach to cooperative digital partnership is extremely important, and that the Quad and the EU can work in tandem or in parallel, if you will, on these challenges, because these countries, when it comes down to it, they need the alternatives that we heard about from the other speaker, that because China has been dominating in this space, countries have had no other choices. So I think it's very important for the EU to be engaged, and they're obviously moving in that direction, and that the Quad, that its use and purpose to be able to help compete with China and provide these countries digital alternatives, that's already starting to happen. And I think it's pretty exciting, and I think we've got a ways to go, but we're certainly moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Dr. Lewis, in your view, what are some of the steps being taken are the steps being taken by the US government sufficient? There's been a lot of criticism, including from people within the government or people who recently departed, that the US isn't doing enough to compete with China and with others. At the same time, are there avenues, in your opinion, for cooperation between the US and some of its competitors, notably China and Russia?
Well, we can dismiss that one right off the top, which is I think that there's very little chance for cooperation with China, because the Chinese have an agenda. Their agenda is the world plays by China's rules. And I'm just not that interested. I'm not sure if anyone else is. The US is doing okay. I mean, that tends to get left out. We need to demonstrate competence. I mean, some people have said there's been a series of policy dilemmas that date back to the Bush administration. So it'd be nice to get a few wins under our belt. One thing that people should remember, though, is that no matter what happens in Washington is coupled to the powerful and dynamic innovation and economic machine of the United States, and it continues to generate growth. That's a problem because in some ways it gives us the luxury to prevaricate. And so when you look at will the U.S. fund research and development? Will the U.S. fund the semiconductor industry? The answer is no, right? The congressional process requires two bills, a bill to authorize spending money and then a bill to appropriate spending money. And unfortunately, Congress hasn't quite gotten around to doing the second bill. So great plans, no money. That's not a winning strategy. So the first thing the U.S. needs to do is fund. We are making good progress on building new alliances. And so the Quad has come up. I think people are probably unaware of how close relations are with Japan. You saw the recent Trade and Technology Council and its 10 working groups, many of which focus around technology. So the US is doing good work, but we need to accelerate strengthening these alliances on tech. We need to be careful not to hamper innovation. And so I talked a little bit about the fears that drive policy. Europe is a good example, which is Europe had a strong tech industry 25 years ago, and they overregulated it out of existence. So the European model is not the model of strength. And we need to work with the Europeans to find something that satisfies their political concerns without killing our own tech giants. And that so far has been hard to do, but the fear that will hamper innovation, I think, is a problem. Finally, you've got the politicization of tech, which is it's become on Wall Street, they call it the shiny object syndrome, which is what is the tech flavor of the week? And is it AI? Is it 5G? Is it quantum? And you get these political discussions that are only remotely connected to economic and scientific reality. So it would help if we could sort of take a step back. I think the key thing here is build alliances, fund research and development. If we can do those two things, you'll see continued success.
Thank you. Mr. Ajijola, a major question amongst those involved in developing and promoting international technology norms relates to enforcement, and that's something that's often not discussed as much. What, in other words, can international organizations and coalitions do to ensure that countries, including, by the way, the most powerful and capable actors such as the United States and China, abide by commitments when it comes to cybersecurity, technological theft, regulation, democratic principles that are underwriting the development of various new technologies?
I think it's about the value proposition. Even when you want to talk about trying to overtake China or compete with China, for example, in Africa, or whether you're trying to enforce norms, it really boils down, in my opinion, to the value proposition. If people find that there is a positive value proposition to collaborating and to making sure that they obey, the enforcement directives, they will. But frankly, if they don't see a positive value proposition, and it's not always that the value proposition must be the benefit for myself alone. There's also a collective benefit. So I think this is part of what we have to do to be able to encourage people to basically adhere, for example, to the norms. Clearly, there's also a need for more people in the global south to participate in the development of the norms so that there's a greater level, stake and level of ownership. And I think this is where, for example, in Africa, and I think much of the global south, we have an urgent need, for a generation of cyber diplomats who can actually be able to engage in some of these discussions. One would recall historically, there was the great Treaty of Berlin in 1884, which divvied up Africa. And sometimes it seems that there is also an ongoing initiative to divvy up the internet, and Africa, again, is not at the table. But also we have to appreciate that to some extent cyber malfeasance is asynchronous, so that sadly it might be possible to also achieve some kind of balance of terror. We've seen this with mutually assured destruction. It seemed to work. It's possible we might see this with North Korea and how it has a balance of cyber terror with its neighbors. So these are some of the things I think we should look at. But just to wind down on this, I also think it's important for us to get our strategic leadership to understand that there are positive value propositions. As I mentioned much earlier, really a lot of African leaders don't see cyber, for example, as an African problem. But if they appreciate that, for example, in cybersecurity in Africa, over the next 10 years, there's envisaged to be a $10 to $15 billion market. So now if they begin to see, well, okay, there's a market here, it might become a societal profit center, not just an organizational cost center. And this way you could generate jobs, probably generate wealth, and as a byproduct, you could generate taxes. Another issue is that ISC Squared in 2020 did a survey where they pointed out that there was actually a 3.1 million number of vacancies, so job opportunities. Now, today we have young Africans crossing the desert and dying. We have young Africans crossing the Mediterranean and dying. If we are able to overproduce the kind of cyber expertise that is required, then one, well, you get the 4 R's. One, you get respect, because these people will now be flown, to these countries, or they could even work remotely in their own countries in Africa. 2, Africa would receive remittances from these people, the diaspora. And 3, they would return with more technological know-how. And finally, the 4th R is that they would build relationships, and those relationships are more likely to facilitate, inward investment into Africa. So I think part of our duty, and this might be the failing of some of us, we've not done enough to convince African leaders that there are some positives so that we can encourage them to look into the norms, look into the cyber issues, and maybe capitalize on them. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, and so last round of questions. And it's actually the same question to all of you. If you were to highlight, maybe we'll start with Dr. Ratamon and go around. If you were to highlight one major decision in the coming years that will decisively shape the geopolitics of technology, what do you think it is and why? So we'll start with Dr. Ratamon and then Curtis, and we'll go around.
I would look at the digital world. I think which is really today the problems, and I think we had colleagues talking about cybersecurity, we are talking about election interference, you're talking about manipulation of news flows. There's so many things have become interlinked. Then we talk about digital commerce. So I think working through a range of rules for us, at least I think for democratic societies, to order some method into this, I think that becomes critical, I think, but it's not really one issue. From semiconductors to social, economic, and political mobilization, I think we're talking about a very, very broad range of issues. But I think we really need to begin to sort these out, because without that, the functioning of the modern society itself, which is under great stress. But a second thing, if you have a second chance, I think how to prevent the next pandemic. I don't know if we can afford to have another one like this, and the way this was managed. And I think it's a serious question, and I think we need to really put our heads down to make sure we discover the next one faster, and we can deal with it much better than we have with this one.
Yeah, I think I would come back to something that James Lewis mentioned in his remarks, which is how effectively we're going to be able to work with partners on these issues. The U.S. cannot do it alone, which is clear. So I think, to the extent that the U.S. can, work with other partners in, setting norms, standards, ethical answers to some of these questions, the U.S. is going to have to work with other like-minded countries, democratic countries, but maybe, countries won't always be democratic, but there at least has to be a certain amount of respect for individual liberty, freedom of expression, and those principles. So I think really that is going to be the key when you're talking about the geopolitics of technology. If we were talking about sort of innovation and cutting edge technologies, then I think it is more looking at sort of investments and working with the private sector. But if we're really talking about what's going to happen geopolitically and in terms of sort of the overall competition with China, I think the key is for the United States to be working with other like-minded nations.
Of course, I agree with everything that my colleagues have said at least twice. But I'd say the question that we need to think about is, what does a post-global world look like? I mean, we are past globalization. The happy days that began with the end of the Cold War, they're over, right? So what does that post-global world look like? And this is a decision for all countries. Where do they fit in? What are the structures? Do we keep some of the old structures like the WTO, which is notable largely for its failure to be effective? It could be fixed, but all countries need to think of, what does a post-global order look like, and where does China fit in with that? I mean, China depends on the West. China depends on the West for research, for technology, for markets. And it will use any method to ensure it has continued access to this. So part of the decision that all countries face, and we've heard it for Africa, we've heard it for India, we've heard it for Europe, what does a post-global world look like, and where does China fit in? Noting that the direction China has taken under its current leadership is discomforting, troubling to say the least. So we will be rebuilding a world order. It may not happen immediately, but it will not be a global order, and it will not be the order that we've lived on with for the last 30 years.
Finally, Mr. Ajijola, what is your view?
From an African perspective, I think it's about capacity building in all its ramifications, whether you're talking about awareness, culture, teaching, learning, research, innovation, and rights.
So, yeah, thank you.
That's it.
So with that, thank you all for a very enriching discussion, somewhat pessimistic, but I think also hopeful in ways about, I think that there is general consensus that we're in for a period of immense transition. And coming to recognize that and to deal with that and to ensure that this sort of new gated, what the organizers call the gated globalized world or post-globalized world really sort of benefits all of us is really going to be the big challenge of our times. So thank you all for your comments on behalf of CyFy. Again, I'm Dhruva Jayashankar, Executive Director of Observer Research Foundation America, and it gives me great pleasure to wrap up this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.